May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our salvation. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning. It's a blessing to be with you this morning, and a privilege to get to share a word of the gospel on the day before, the day that we celebrate the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I grew up with Dr. King as a big and important figure in my school life, especially. And the way that Dr. King's life was presented to us, kids growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, was through the dream. And the message was from our teachers, who I later realized were, in many cases, people who had, in their own flesh, experienced the segregation and the violence that Dr. King fought against, and in other cases, who had stood by in the discomfort and the shame of knowing that it was people who looked like them that were perpetrating that violence and that segregation. And what those teachers taught us, kids growing up in the first generation of integrated schools where we lived, was that we were the dream. That the civil rights chapter was closed, that it was done, and that it had been done for us, and that now all that was left was for us to live that dream. That for my Black classmates, they were to go out and seize the world and be a part of all the spaces that had been denied to their parents and grandparents. And for the white kids, we were meant to erase whatever small bits of prejudice might come our way and remind other people in our families and communities that all of us were equal, and we were to go forth and live the dream. And of course, it didn't stay that simple. But in many ways, I'm grateful for that grounding. And for those teachers who wanted that to be true, who wanted to be able to say to us that the future they were giving us was a future that we weren't going to have to fight for, a future that was not going to push some of us to the edges and create paths for others of us to the center. I'm grateful that they wanted it to be done, and that they wanted it to be done for us. Fast forward a few years, and I was more aware of the many ways in which the work of equality, the work of valuing human personhood in this country and in this world is not yet done. And I came to my first church now in the late 1990s, and one of the things that I was involved in the community was supporting workers in the tourism industry in Los Angeles, where I lived, who were fighting for a share in the massive juggernaut that is LA tourism. So these were hotel workers near the beaches, near the airport, near the theme parks. These were people who cleaned and staffed the airport. The working people whose lives made LA's prosperity possible. And I had a parishioner in my first church who was himself someone who had lived and participated in civil rights work. And I later came to realize that I had misunderstood a little bit even what that meant. So Ken Adams was born in 1912, so he was already in his mid-80s when I met him. And I introduced him once as someone who had been part of the civil rights movement. I knew he had done lunch counter sit-ins, and I described those as being in the 1960s. And he very politely took me aside later and said, actually, that was the 1930s and 40s in Chicago. So he'd been around for a minute, and he had been doing the work. And he was, as an African-American man in his mid-80s, someone who had seen a lot of things. So I took Ken with me because he was intrigued by this organizing work. I took him with me to a picket line. And we were out there with the hotel housekeepers, who were mostly Latina immigrant women. And there were a couple of my older pastor colleagues who were often at these things. And they had brought their guitars because they were from the 60s. And they sang, among other things, "We Shall Overcome." And I had grown up singing "We Shall Overcome" in school as part of our learning about the civil rights movement. And honestly, I was a little embarrassed that we were singing this song that for me belonged to the past and belonged in the past, that it didn't belong to us. That we weren't the people who had stood in front of those water hoses and faced down those dogs and walked across that bridge. We were the next generations. And I was embarrassed especially to be singing it in front of Ken. We didn't really talk about it at the time, but a few weeks later, he and I were invited to meet with a group of younger organizers who had asked faith leaders from around the region to talk to them about how faith could strengthen the work that they were doing for justice, and how faith could sustain them as they worked for a better world. And Ken and I talked about what we were going to say to them, and what we decided was that we were going to talk about how people of faith believe in miracles. And I was going to talk a little bit about the biblical miracle stories, stories like the one that we read today about Elijah and the widow and the cake that became sustenance just at the point that she thought that all hope was lost. And the story that Jesus references with Elisha, who was the next generation after Elijah, and the stories that we know about Jesus and the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes, and all the different ways that our faith tradition has passed down to us. Not miracles in the sense that in any given situation we can just call down the outcome that we want, but miracles in the sense that things that we do not believe are possible can happen. And so Ken then was going to tell some stories from his life and his activism. And Ken, in his mid-80s, was still an activist. In fact, he got up every morning and he put on this little pin, just one of those old sort of round pins that you don't see that often anymore, that said, "Abolish the death penalty." And that was Ken's thing. Every day, I never saw Ken not wearing that pin. In fact, I know that he was buried with it on. And he wrote letters about the death penalty, and he gave money to anti-death penalty organizations, and it was his justice cause. So he was going to kind of talk about what it was like to be a lifelong activist and to have seen some things really change. But what he said that I remember the most, and that I know those younger organizers remember the most, actually, was about singing "We Shall Overcome" with this group of hotel housekeepers on Century Boulevard in Los Angeles. He said, "It filled me with joy to hear that song sung again, and to feel like maybe this next generation was going to carry the dream forward. That maybe that dream was still alive, and that there were people who were ready to go the next leg of the journey." And he said, "I'm an old man." Ken went on to live until 2016 when he died a few months shy of his 104th birthday. So he got to see President Obama elected, which was, watching Ken watch President Obama get elected was one of the great moments of my life. He was overwhelmed to have lived to see that happen. But he said, back in the 90s, "I'm an old man, and I want to know that this dream is not going to die with this generation. That it's going to go on, that you're going to keep singing that song." And I went from kind of rolling my eyes when the older guys would trot out that song at rallies to tearing up a little bit every time I hear it. So I guess this is what I want to leave you with today, this weekend, going into tomorrow, is that this is our inheritance. That we inherit miracles and the stories of change and transformation that nobody would have believed was possible. And we also inherit a dream that is not yet fully complete, not yet fulfilled. A dream where, as Dr. King used to talk about it, as the thriving of human personality. And I think he meant not so much personality as our quirks and our ways of being, but personhood. Like that people's personness needs to be able to thrive. So we inherit that dream. And what an inheritance. I think it's been easier in recent years to see all of the things, the brokenness that we've inherited, the ways that our history and our ancestors have betrayed, the goodness that we were meant for, the ways that we continue to participate in and benefit from in complicated ways, that brokenness. But I want to stay focused going forward on this inheritance of a dream. I feel responsible as someone who attended Ken Adams' 100th birthday party, where he told me that being 100 felt a lot like being 99, just in case you're wondering what it feels like. But I feel responsible for carrying that dream forward. And now that I'm firmly in the second half of life, I'm starting to, think like I got to figure out like what's going to be on my button, What am I going to put on every day that matters? That's like my thing. And the other thing that Ken did in his 90s was that he figured out how much money he thought he needed for the rest of his life, presuming that he lived into his hundreds, which he did. And he gave the rest of his money away. And he gave it away because he had seen a TV show that was about how women in, I think it was in Kenya, it was in East Africa, were having to walk miles to carry water back to their communities, and how it was damaging their bodies and taking all their time and using up all the calories that they were managing to take in. And he gave a large sum, six-figure sum, to Episcopal Relief and Development to start a project that dug wells in local communities so that these women could get water closer to home. And that was where he decided he wanted to leave his legacy. So I'm carrying him with me going into tomorrow and remembering that we are a people that carry stories of miracles. We are a people that stand on the shoulders of people who have gone before us, and that in our lifetimes and in the lifetimes of those we have known, real transformation has taken place. And it's not finished, but it's possible. Things that we could not have foreseen have become true. And that none of that is finished, that it's not over, that we are still people of those miracles. And so behind and ahead of us are miracles, and behind and ahead of us is that dream, which goes all the way back to God and comes all the way down to us. A dream that God's people, the peoplehood of God's people, will be fully protected and cared for and realized. Amen.